Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Gene, good to see you again.
Always fun talking to you, Matt, and indeed, it was a pleasure talking to a couple of your guys at the Kibbe kibbutz.
Yeah, the Kibbe kibbutz, otherwise known as the Free the People production team.
Yes.
And you are, I'm one to talk because I'm in Washington, D.C., but you're in the belly of the beast. You're in New York City right now, right?
Yeah. I just accused you of being in the belly of the beast, yeah. Matt. You're 2 blocks away from the Supreme Court. Anyway, okay, so I'm in the belly of the beast. Yeah, I'm in Manhattan. I'm a lower Manhattanite, and indeed, I like to say, look, obviously it's a socialist city, but there are many dimensions to it. I'm at 55 Great Jones Street, 3rd Street off 3rd Avenue, literally around the corner from where my grandfather had his used clothing store, Epstein's Clothing, new and used, bought and sold. Living with my wife Asako, we run the Soul Forum. It's filled with entrepreneurial energy here, and so that's that's exciting, and that's part of the reason why I still love New York. Been living here for over 50 years, and unfortunately, I can't leave.
Yeah, and I went back to New York for the first time in almost 2 years, about a month ago, and things seemed more normal. Like, do you feel like things have returned to normal? Are there still restrictions on your behavior?
No, indeed. Look, I mean, certainly, I don't know. I'm sorry you didn't drop by, Matt, and say hello. Again, I'm Great Jones off Bowery, 3rd Street off 3rd Avenue. It's filled with young people, with a lot of energy. I'm a denizen of Broadway. I love Broadway shows. Times Square is filled with people. And so it's almost like you wouldn't know that the city was hit by the lockdown, and you wouldn't know that Times Square was at one point just a ghost town, and our neighborhood as well. I've stayed the course. I've not lived in New York City the whole time. My wife Asako fled the city and stayed up state with my stepson and his wife in New Hampshire, but I've been around continuously even through the lockdowns.
So we might have done this last time. We had a conversation at Pork Fest. I want to say 2 years ago, but
a year ago, July.
Okay, so for purposes of this, like what I want to accomplish today, depending on what else we want to accomplish, is go through some basic Austrian concepts, Austrian economics, that might inform us, given the craziness going on with the economy. And apply those to what we're hearing today and what we're seeing, and like some really weird stuff going on. But you're the best guy I could think of, because you're both schooled in academic Austrian economics, but you're also a practical guy that has spent most of your career applying economic concepts to the actual marketplace. So give us a quick version of your resume, because you were at the New York Stock Exchange and other places.
Yeah, I was and picking up, I was a senior economist at the New York Stock Exchange. Prior to that, I'd been director of commodity research at a major firm. And so I learned commodities. I did a lot of sort of macro stuff at the New York Stock Exchange. It was a cushy job. That ended. And then I did 26 years at Barron's Financial Weekly, covering the economy, covering the numbers. And of course, I think it should be obvious enough that the difficulty of being both somebody trained as an Austrian and then trying to divine what is going on in the economy from numbers that were developed often by pretty bright people, but by people who did not have an Austrian perspective. That's the difficulty. And that's the difficulty I think we're going to face when we begin to talk about applying Austrian principles to what has been going on. I know the numbers very well, and I know what are good numbers and bad numbers in particular, but that doesn't mean that I've got all the answers with respect to where the economy is going, except it's clearly headed for recession. So that anticipates where we're going to go with this, but I'd like to lay the groundwork on a couple of broad concepts in order to make it clear to people why I do have the Austrian perspective. So can I do that? Yes.
Yeah, but let's go back a little bit further, because I don't think we talked about this last time, but you were at the New School. I
Oh,
think
yes.
getting your
Okay.
master's,
All
and
right.
you found a copy of Murray Rothbard's book.
Yes. Yes, right. Exactly. Yeah. And okay. Yeah. Look, usually I say to people, hey, come on, my intellectual journey started when I was 6 years old because mommy was a commie and I was a rock rib Stalinist. But okay, Matt, because you told me that time is of the essence. We've only got an hour and maybe only 55 minutes left. So I better cut to where I'm at the new school. And so I was still struggling with being a socialist at that point. I was actually, my career was greatly helped by the fact that I became writing assistant and research assistant to Robert Heilbroner. Maybe you're old enough to know who he was. He was a best-selling author in economics, and he wrote me recommendations and so on. So I got a good job on Wall Street on his recommendation because everybody had read his book, Worldly Philosophers. So, but I was a little lost intellectually. I did end up dropping out of economics in any case because I didn't like college teaching. But I did discover Murray Rothbard's book, Man, Economy, and State. And it really wasn't so much the fact that he was a libertarian that caught me up. It was the fact that the book clarified so much for me about how it was possible to actually espouse in economics. As I like to say, really the idea that you use the phrase Austrian economics is almost a redundancy. All of us think naturally in Austrian terms, in terms of the beginning with the individual, the motivations of individuals and markets. And indeed, even the mainstream does, and that's why every once in a while they come up with something insightful. Milton Friedman wrote this ridiculous methodology paper that's become notorious. They never even bothered to defend about the methodology of economics being just that you make decent predictions, and it doesn't matter how you describe things, just are your predictions accurate? It was ludicrous. And of course, Milton Friedman never actually wrote that way or thought that way anyway, in terms of his better essays and articles and insights. And so that, I hope, tells you a little bit about why I was influenced by the Austrian school. And then because there was a bricks and mortar store called Laissez-faire Bookshop in downtown Manhattan, I lived uptown, I visited the store almost every weekend, bought a couple of books, and over the years that ensued, as on the side, I went through all the Austrians, including Friedrich Hayek, of course, Hazlitt, Rothbard, Israel Kirzner, and of course Mises. And so I became schooled in Austrian economics. But meanwhile, I had the day job. I was a senior economist in the New York Stock Exchange, and I covered the economy for Barron's. And sometimes in my columns, which ran only about 800 to 900 words, you might not know I'm an Austrian because of the difficulties of covering the economy for the average person, the investors mostly at Barron's, who don't know from Austrian economics in any case. But of course, if anybody who steadily read me knew that I had an Austrian perspective. So that's hopefully fills you in a little bit.
Yeah, it does. And I like you were attracted to Austrian economics basically because it was a practical way that helped you understand the world in a way that neoclassical Keynesian economics just wouldn't, because it's so mechanistic and it pretends to be, it pretends to be physics, even it ends up being gibberish, but
pretends to be physics, pretends to be math. And on top of that, the mainstream is hobbled by a further motivation that all of them would love to, most of them would love to get out of the classroom, love to get a great job at the Treasury, at the Federal Reserve. They all want to sit at the tables of power. I exaggerate somewhat. Many of them want to sit at the tables of power. So there too, they tend to look at the economy from this top-down perspective. With those two handicaps, it's remarkable that many of them are still worth reading anyway, because when they take off the cloak and they try to think through what's really going on in the economy, they naturally sound like Austrians. So in a way, I discovered that I just have to look in the mirror. This is the kind of economics I practiced on the side, the Austrian economics, thinking rationally about how people operate in markets and what their motivation is.
Okay, let's do a quick walk through. This is ridiculous, but we're going to do a quick walk through Menger, Hayek, Mises.
Oh my God.
and Rothbard on the nature of money, inflation, and the business cycle, because I think those apply directly to what we're going to talk about in practical terms.
Okay, well, the money thing is an easy one, and actually, I have a strong hobby horse with that, with the concept of money, because I think Mises put it best when he said that money is simply a medium of exchange. It's a thing that we use instead of barter, and he said, full stop. He said the idea that money is also a store of value, or that we use it to measure things and so on, that all springs from the fact that it is a medium of exchange. And Mises went a bit further and made the obvious point that when it comes to storing value, it's possible, of course, to still be the proverbial French peasant and put money in the mattress, or keep your money in the basement, the way Silas Marner in that novel did. Your gold in the basement. But in an advanced industrial economy with stock markets and bond markets and ways of buying real estate through real estate investment trusts, generally speaking, we store value in those investment instruments. And I that's one of my hobby horses, because it gets me a little bit tired out when the crypto people like to talk about money being a store of value. Crypto is at this point an instrument of speculation. It's not a store of value. People are speculating on the possibility that it could become money. To some small extent, it is money. But again, people do not use money. Rational people, most of us who have our heads screwed on right, do not use money as a store of value. So money is simply a medium of exchange. And the thing to bear in mind is that we value money. We average idiot slobs value money because of what it could buy yesterday. We know that $100 could buy a certain amount yesterday, and yesterday we knew that $100 could buy a certain amount the day before that, and the day before that. That's why we use dollars as money. But then the question becomes, if you keep going back in time, the day before that and the day before that, you have to ask yourself, where did it all start? And as Mises points out, it had to have started with some kind of a commodity like gold or seashells. What was true on day zero, when there was no yesterday? And on day zero, people began to use this commodity that everybody valued, like gold or seashells, as money. And then of course it began to become important as money, and people then worked with it on the basis of the day before concept. So the point that Mises was making is that all money must originate in a commodity, and that I think is a very deep insight. It always excited me because it's kind of just an inference about human nature that gives you a notion of history. And of course, it was properly called the regression theorem. You regress back in time. Now, partly because I was in bed with the regression theorem, it took me a while to appreciate the possibility that cryptocurrency could sort of leech upon that and also become money. Now, of course, to pick up another aspect of it, which is, why do we use dollars as money? Because those dollars evolved from gold. I needn't belabor that. The dollar used to be tied to gold, and then government eventually severed that tie. But still, because those dollars could have bought something yesterday and the day before that and the day before that, we use those dollars as money. And then the reason why gold became money is that one of the key reasons why gold became money is because it's very expensive to expand the supply. And the expansion of the supply of money is something that government likes to do, because government can raise money through taxing, it can raise money through borrowing, but it's much easier to raise money for its operations by creating money. And so a government's penchant for creative money causes inflation, and gold or crypto is our defense against the debasement of money. And that's the reason why, by the way, we need a free market in banking, because in a competitive free market in banking, the banks will discipline each other. The Federal Reserve creates a monopoly whereby money creation and money expansion is underwritten by the central bank that has the power to print money. A free market in banking is a much better guarantee that our money will remain relatively stable, and that banks will not expand the money supply, through fractional reserve banking to any great extent. So I guess I know I've gone over a lot of points fairly quickly, and you maybe want to elaborate a little bit on my on what I've just said.
No, that was a beautiful summary, and
okay.
The idea that inflation is caused by anything other than government expansion of the money supply is something we debate all the time. We're debating.
Oh wow, yes, well, sure, okay,
today.
yeah. Well, yeah, no, indeed, and you know, there are little nuances to it that having to do with the somewhat cockamamie notion of velocity, you know, which we could go into. You know, I think, by the way, Henry Hazlitt wrote a book about it called Inflation, dated, I think it was 1971. He taught me more about velocity than anybody else did, about the concept of velocity or the money to hold. But really, it's clear enough as the first approximation that you could just resort to Milton Friedman. Well, Milton Friedman was again said, and price inflation is everywhere, always and everywhere, a monetary phenomenon. And as he elaborated, he said, well, you think price inflation is being caused by oil. All the oil price is up. Yes, the oil price is up because oil is a necessity. And if oil is scarce and the price goes up, we're just going to have to buy it whatever the price is. But obviously that means we have less money left over to buy other things. And so the general array of prices is not going to rise unless the money supply expands. So I thought that was a cogent enough explanation. And of course, if you and I were talking to some really some real insightful monetarist technicians, they bring in the concept of velocity, and the Austrians would bring in the concept of money to hold. But really, those are very, very incidental, minor issues to belabor. The real point again is that if the price level is not going to rise unless the money supply expands. The price level in general is not going to rise unless the money supply expands. And we have ample evidence that, of course, is what's happened based upon just the conventional measure of M2. We have ample measure that what happened to fuel it was that the U.S. government, the U.S. Treasury, starting in February of 2020, began to push the Treasury debt up by the trillions. And that Treasury debt, if we just look at the official records, was taken up by the Federal Reserve through printed money, and that printed money ended up in M2, which was also off the charts. A few just simple charts from standard mainstream sources would tell you what the source of the recent price inflation was. Yeah.
You know, all this seems like common sense to me, but I am personally surprised at the traction that modern monetary theory gets today. But I suspect it's political convenience. They've taxed as much as they can, they've borrowed as much as they can in order to do what they've done over the last 2 years. Spend, what is it, $6 trillion? It's probably more. They needed to print a lot of money.
Yes.
Is that why modern monetary theory is considered credible? And like, it's alchemy, right?
Wow.
Like we could just make up wealth out of nothing.
Well, gosh, oh, wow. Okay, if you're going to start talking about MMT, which I like to call modern monetary tyranny, then that gets into some difficult issues. The point is that, again, it was actually a left-wing economist, I know why I have to credit, Robert Cashman, who quipped that in the old days, government just printed money. He said, now we're much more subtle. First, the government prints bonds, then it prints money. But although, of course, it's still conceivable that when the government debt expands, it could sell that debt legitimately to people who are buying that debt. So that can happen, although it's a little bit complicated. When it sells it abroad, it's probably selling that debt to other central banks in other countries. But it could legitimately be borrowing money, the government. But of course, we know that this time around, we do have data as released by the St. Louis Fed, the federal data. It's called FRED, and we do know, we can trace it easily. The debt exploded, and the debt held by the Federal Reserve exploded accordingly. So we know that it was picked up by the Fed. But to get to the MMTers, they're actually filled with a certain amount of word salad, and sometimes you're punching a pillow with these people. Bear in mind that they will stipulate that you really don't have to finance the government through taxes or through legitimate sale of bonds. You don't have to do that. All you really have to do is just have the government just print bonds and then sell them to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will print the money that finances the government. And that's supposed to be a real breakthrough in thinking. But in fact, it's like it's old wine in new bottles, because that's what the government has been doing for years. Every time it fights a war, it can sell bonds, but most of those bonds are taken up by money printing, and so that's an old story. And why do I call it monetary tyranny? Because I assume that you don't necessarily just have to be an Austrian or an individualist, or why not just be an average liberal and say that if the government has the license to print money and not go to the people and say we've got to raise the money through taxing and borrowing legitimately, because we have no right to take the initiative and impose on you our power to print money and allocate resources to ourselves unless we raise it legitimately through taxing and borrowing. I try to tell capital D Democrats, isn't that offensive? Don't you think? And of course, most of them actually believe that the government does raise its money through taxing and borrowing, through legitimate borrowing and through legitimate taxing. But it's got that loophole, which is money printing. And money printing is obviously tyrannical for clear reasons. Now, of course, but it's okay with the MMTers because we imagine that the government is run by a bunch of prudent philosopher kings. They do stipulate, by the way, that there's a danger when government does this. The danger is price inflation. And so you would have thought that the MMTers would have their tails between their legs right now, because we are getting a certain amount of disturbing price inflation. And yet they apparently are arguing, I'm not up to date on their ludicrousness. I think they're arguing that it was all because of the supply chain problems that didn't have anything to do with the money supply. I'm not even quite, I've given up on these people, so I don't even know quite what they're saying now. But in any case, that's the broad brushstroke of MMTers, that the money that the government really doesn't have to tax and borrow. All it has to do is print money. And I actually think that some of my colleagues, like Bob Murphy, they get into sort of pointless arguments with these people. I would only just make the declaration that is tyranny. Doesn't it bother you to think that a government can simply print money at will anytime it wants to spend money? Isn't that disturbing to anybody, any citizen? And so that's where I like it to stop and start when I deal with the MMTers.
And by the way, it's so regressive. You've made this point many times, but expanding the money supply is really the most insidious form of wealth transfer from insiders to away from people that actually have money in their wallet. They have money in their paycheck. They have money in their savings accounts. And
no, indeed, just no. It's classic. That is classic trickle down. I mean,
right.
The progressives make fun of this bogeyman that supposedly the free market people talk about trickle down, and that's a whole can of worms. But the obvious point is, but guys, if you don't like trickle down, then you should really join us to picket the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, because they're engaging in the most blatant trickle down ever. That money falls into the hands of the banksters, and it's supposed to trickle down to us, and it's in the trillions. That's the ultimate. That's Niagara Falls of trickle down, and you guys are allowing it to happen.
Let's talk about the banksters and how the injection points that Mises talks about, and the business cycle theory a little bit, because I know you don't think that this is a classic Austrian business cycle, but just to give people a frame of reference.
Oh, just a moment. No. All I said was that this. I believe that the recession occurred in 2020, and that we're out of that recession. That was a brief recession. I wrote an article called "The Great Suppression," I did it with, so to speak, invoking the authority of Murray Rothbard, because this is an important hobby horse of mine with respect to clarifying what the Austrian business cycle is all about and why it's a plausible analysis of why downturns happen. But Murray Rothbard specifically wrote in his book, The Great Depression, his empirical study of the 1920s into the 1930s, he specifically wrote that not all economic contractions necessarily occur according to the script of the Austrian business cycle. Sometimes the king goes crazy. And so I just read it. I said, my God, every once in a while, I'm pretty prescient. I made some forecasts, and most of them ended up being true. I wrote this in February of early March. It was published in early March. I wrote it in February of 2020. And I said that what we're in for is a Great Suppression. The government has gone crazy. It's locking down the economy. And so obviously that's what's going to bring the huge unemployment. It's simply declaring that 50 to 60% of all economic activity has simply got to stop. So it's not an Austrian business cycle. And then I said that once they lift it, once they lift the clamps, there will likely be a fairly rapid recovery. I stipulated, well, they're going to destroy certain businesses, so it won't be exactly V-shaped. So that's what happened then, and that's part of the point that I want to make about the Austrian business cycle theory, because in my neck of the woods, so to speak, I'm constantly confronting skeptics about the plausibility of the idea that this one theory basically explains most, if not all, of the actual downturns. So here I pounced because I thought, well, I'm going to point out that this is indeed the great exception. And what I said, what I wrote, pretty much came true. There was a fairly rapid recovery once the government began to lift the lockdowns, and so that's really what it was all about. But that segues into my main argument, which is that I also hear people say a couple of things. Number one, well, aren't there other ways of disrupting the economy? Again, let's hopefully they all agree, and let's stipulate that when we talk in abstract terms and we talk about an economic contraction, we're really talking, as Rothbard said, about the odd convergence of bankruptcies. Over the course of the free market economy, we get bankruptcies all the time. But in Austria, but the downturns that we're talking about consist of a whole lot of bankruptcies happening at once. That there's so many that many people get laid off. Many bankruptcies, many defaults happening at the same time. So that the conventional measures that the Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes pick it up. Suddenly there's a downturn in GDP. Gross domestic product. And so then people ask, why are you just latching on your own particular mishigas about why this is happening? Aren't there other reasons why there could be a downturn? And I like to say, look, Rothbard already said the king could go crazy. And so that's why there could be a downturn. But then I like to ask them about various other possibilities that I fully grant. Suppose we all decided by next week we're going to live like monks. Suppose we decided that we're going to cut our consumer spending by 50%. I've often used the example of that we're all going to go kosher, and we're suddenly not going to eat 80% of the food that's produced and 90% of the food that's produced, and the kosher prices are going to go up. But that's probably a bad example. So suppose that here's another example from real life. When I was at Barron's, there was a guy named Richard Hokinson. I don't know if he's still operating. But he carved out a niche for him at a major Wall Street firm, and he was a demographer. And he predicted that there was going to be a major downturn in early 1997 because there was a shortage of 25-year-olds. And I'm even forgetting, I wrote an article called Hokinson's Hokum. I interviewed with him, and he was surprised that I thought he was full of shit. He thought I would write it up like he knew what he was talking about. But in fact, I called it Hokinson's Hokum. The 25-year-olds would be scarce because he traced the births at the time, and so there would be a big pullback in consumer spending. But the whole point is that entrepreneurs anticipate that. If you actually talk to retailers, that most of them are amateur demographers. They're all looking at the demographic trends. So many of the disruptions that occur in consumer spending that usually happen slowly. With the demographics, it usually happens slowly anyway. But the point is that you could be sure that if it was going to happen quickly, that there was going to be a certain fall off in a certain big segment of consumer spending, the retailers would be all over it because that's part of their plans. So therefore, most those things are not going to bring down, they're not going to cause a convergence of bankruptcies because business anticipates it. But here, let me get to almost the most ludicrous part of this, which is that I was in that article on the Great Suppression. I quoted the Wall Street Journal of all places. The Wall Street Journal in a way, began to recognize in an article that was a major feature article that this Great Suppression was happening. But then there was this paragraph explaining the 08-09 recession, and it said it was because of a collapse of wealth and income. It was a demand side collapse. That's what the Wall Street Journal said. And so, all you have to do is look at the standard national income accounts, and you find that consumer spending was at its peak in the second quarter of 2008. Consumer spending rose through fourth quarter of 2007, real consumer spending, and it dipped a little bit, and then it hit a new peak in second quarter of 2008, and that was already into the second quarter of the recession that had already begun. And so how could the consumer spending was rising, and so they don't even bother to look it up. They don't even bother to recognize that you cannot find, just in the conventional income account, a single recession that was preceded by a decline in consumer spending. Consumer spending declines once the recession begins because you get massive layoffs, massive unemployment. And so my point then is that we should indeed cooperate with these skeptics and round up the usual suspects and ask and stipulate that there are possible disruptions that can occur and that could cause this wave of bankruptcies. But the one kind of disruption that seems to recur happens in the investment markets and then if you trace it out, it happens because of actions by the Federal Reserve. And then we get a further objection. We could put a little flesh on what that means. We get a further objection, which is that, well, look, if you're going to argue that business is really smart and it anticipates demographic changes, then if you guys keep talking about this Austrian business cycle theory that strikes, why doesn't business anticipate that one? Why is this one reason? Oh, they have us dead to rights. Why isn't it that? Why can't business just roll with that punch? Why do they all overinvest? And the one obvious answer to that, by the way, and I have a special answer to that. The one obvious answer to that is that it's partly because most businessmen don't believe in Austrian business cycle theory. Most of them actually thought that Ben Bernanke and Greenspan before him were actually doing fine. They didn't really think that what the Federal Reserve was doing was going to cause a business cycle. That's the major reason. The retailers understand demographics, but they don't understand business cycle theory. And by the way, as I like to stress, I spoke to two bankers, John Allison, whom you may have heard of, and sure, Charles Calomares, who was a professor who also ran a bank. In their case, going into 05, 06, 07, they knew what was coming, and they managed their banks to try to roll with that punch, and they survived. And so I by the way, would actually stress that if we actually could get all the bankers and all the finance people to read Austrian business cycle theory, then maybe this wouldn't be nearly as serious it wouldn't be nearly as serious a downturn when the Federal Reserve does what it does. But the additional problem is that the worst get on top. The additional problem is that the bank, in the case of the 08, 09 recession leading up to it, the banker in the starched collar who wouldn't give you the mortgage because your credit wasn't good or your job history wasn't good gets replaced by the casino capitalist. So the worst people run the economy, and they look for short-term profits, and many of them get away with it. And so that's the additional reason why this thing keeps happening again and again. So I like to lay the groundwork in that sense because I'm familiar with the skeptical reaction. We Austrians begin to sound like we just have this big penchant to blame everything on the Federal Reserve and blame everything on the banking system and not recognize their objections. So I hopefully have addressed their objections in what I've just said.
You know, it's funny because we like to blame the Federal Reserve and how expanding the money supply screws up relative prices and creates clusters of failures. That in essence is the Austrian business cycle theory. But in reality, you're dealing with, and you touched on this very early, and it's sort of a Hayek point that the worst get on top, and that economists who play the game and say that you can manipulate, that it's some sort of science of political manipulation, they're the guys that get hired. So you end up with a self-affirming set of insiders that think no matter what happens, they can redesign their way out of it.
Sure. Yeah, indeed. And yes. And that, of course, obviously the worst get on top is a phrase that I picked up from Hayek. But although, I mean, he mentioned it in another context, but to my mind, it's important to stress, and I think it's a point that's often missed, which is if you actually look at some of the personalities that during that were agents in the housing bubble that set off the 08-09 recession, then they really were the worst. They really were crap shooters. They really had no sense, and they do get on top because there's a lot of money to be made by operating that way. I think that's an important point to stress as well.
Yeah, that's that. I love the phrase bankster because it's a bankster is someone that plays politics as opposed to finance. And gets rich in the process at the expense of the rest of us. I want to jump forward to today.
Sure. Okay.
And throw a couple quotes at you. There's been some interesting statements made. I'll start with Donald Trump. Recently, he said something that must have been on Truth because he's not allowed on Twitter anymore. But he said something to the effect of, "I shut off the economy, but then I turned it back on, as if it was a switch on the wall." And when
did he shut it? When did he shut it off?
He shut it off in February, March of
2020. Of course.
When he was president, and then I don't know when he turned it back on exactly. As if it was a switch on the wall. But in some ways, your Great Suppression, another way to say that is I put my boot on the neck of the small business guys by telling them that they couldn't produce things.
Right.
And then I took my boot off and they started recovering a little bit.
Yes.
Is that the suppression part of the 2.5 year cycle we're going through?
Oh, wow. What a question. All right. Yeah, indeed. Let me backtrack a second. The reason why I was puzzled when you said that Trump said he put his boot on, in fact, based upon everything I know, it was simply that Trump allowed the states to do what they want. He allowed what's somewhat misleadingly called federalism to happen. He didn't interfere. He was quite passive in every conceivable way, by the way, which is truly appalling. I obviously have mixed feelings about Florida's Ron DeSantis, but DeSantis probably would have operated differently. So it really wasn't that Trump did it. It was really just 45. But basically 45.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit.
Oh,
because Trump's people, infamously Birx and Fauci, and who's the third in the triumvirate, they made everybody an offer they couldn't refuse, because they were pushing for lockdowns, and the CDC, Walensky was the third one. They were Trump's people, and he platformed them. I don't want to pick on Trump, because I want to get to picking on Biden.
I know.
But
okay.
But he did enable and provide cover for state radical governors like in New York, and California, and other places.
Yes, well, that's true. True. Although if you read Scott Atlas's book, you know who Scott Atlas was brought in by Trump. And Scott Atlas writes a really revealing portrait of how he was combating these three people whom you just mentioned, and how, in fact, Scott Atlas was trying to get Trump to switch course, but the three of them told Trump that if he tried to undermine them, they would all three resign at once. Undermine any one of them, all three of them would resign at once, and Trump got intimidated by that. And so therefore Trump simply did not have the strength and resolve or the intellect to let them resign and to cause the problems that ensued. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. But of course, I do grant your point. He clearly was fostering the lockdowns, although he couldn't stop DeSantis from opening up. So you're right, he was encouraging the lockdown, but he wasn't, of course, decreeing them. He was just basically facilitating them through those three people. True enough. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's fair.
But okay, but you want to ask me the tougher question, which is indeed, look, I want to now try to answer your question by broadening the issue, and unfortunately, I guess disappointing anybody who's listened to me so far. Hopefully, I've had a few insights, and now I'm going to say that I find that the official numbers, which again were not devised by Austrians, the official numbers all I have to go on, because I could go on anecdotes, but obviously anecdotes have problems, and you want to go on numbers that are compiled broadly about what's going on in the economy, and there's a lot of difficulties. I want to backtrack one point and make this general observation, which is that I believe from the official numbers that the most severe recessions were 74, 75, then 81, 82, and then we had two mild recessions, 90, 91, and then 2001, and then we had the Great Suppression. And then we had the recession, the Great Recession, which was the worst ever since World War II. And I find that none of my Austrian colleagues, and certainly not me, can fully explain that pattern. It's sometimes difficult to know actually where the malinvestment is. It was fairly straightforward that in 2001, it was dot-coms. It was a wave of bankruptcies there that caused the mild recession. And it's fairly straightforward that the housing bubble caused the 08-09 recession, and that was clearly an Austrian playbook as well. Although, by the way, I bow to those who debate the issue, who claim that the housing bubble did not have to cause as serious a recession as it did, that the Federal Reserve mishandled it in different ways. And there's a lot of controversy that I can't fully settle. So when I talk about that I have difficulty even explaining with the benefit of hindsight the pattern of recessions going back to the mid-70s, and then now the numbers are even more confounding. And so the only thing that I'm fairly sure of is that we're headed for a recession. Two of my more prominent colleagues, so to speak, David Stockman and Peter Schiff, believe that it's self-evident that it's going to be the mother of all downturns. It's going to be the worst disaster ever. But I find that it's very difficult to say. And of course, with part of me, I hope that's not going to happen. It isn't as though I take any pleasure in predicting a recession. I like to see good times, and I do think that a libertarian revolution could happen out of good times just as much as it can happen out of bad times. So, but maybe I ducked your question completely. Well, you had a specific question you were going to pose.
So we have. It strikes me that this is why it's so uncertain. And I agree with you. I don't know exactly what's going on. I don't know what's going to happen. I can point to some.
Well, recession is going to happen. I believe that.
Sure.
But
like I think that the last 2.5 years have done such structural damage to the economy that I think it's going to be a doozy. And I hope the rosy scenario is the true scenario. But you had, like, I don't think there's a historical precedent for just shutting down the economy and breaking all of these supply chains the way that we did in 2020. So
you don't think that there's some evidence that they're getting repaired, the supply chains? I mean, oddly enough, I guess we have a reverse viewpoint because I see, I ran the Soho Forum. We're going to have a couple of minutes for me to plug my Soho Forum.
Sure.
And of course, I suffered as a small businessman through the Soho Forum, but my Soho Forum is now flourishing again. So look at all that entrepreneurial energy that came from Gene Epstein, that they didn't destroy me. I lost a lot of business. I brought the Soho Forum. Okay. I brought it back in September of last year when they were still imposing mask requirements, and then they weren't. And the audiences were like, less than 1/2 of what they used to be, but we're building them back. And then New York City has come back. So again, I'd like to try to say to many of my Austrian colleagues that there's this other thing going. I'll tell you one interesting story which you might like. I used to interview Milton Friedman. I called him up 3 or 4 times a year, and we had chats about this and that and so on. And then of course when I asked him about Austrian business cycle theory, he thought he had the decisive. Now this is Milton Friedman not thinking like an Austrian, but thinking like a macro guy. He said, "Now wouldn't you expect that the strength of an expansion would be symmetrical with the severity of a collapse? Wouldn't that be what you'd look for in order to verify Austrian business cycle theory?" And he said, "But you don't find that at all." And he thought that was the end of the argument. He thought that he'd just proven that Austrian business cycle theory couldn't be valid. So I said politely, Dr. Friedman, that to begin with, there might be some measurement problems anyway with the strength of an expansion, strength of a collapse, but more to the point and more decisively, there are always healthy aspects of an expansion. There is a lot of entrepreneurial energy still in this U.S. economy, still in our society. So an expansion that's measured by the official measures that looks strong, maybe a lot of it was healthy. And so if a lot of it was healthy, that doesn't necessarily mean that a strong expansion is going to lead to a sudden collapse. So therefore, I don't think you've refuted Austrian business cycle theory on the basis of that analysis. And so I pointed that out to him, and then I want to point out to you that the unseen thing is the strength of the Soho Forum. It's come back. I see restaurants that have come back. They kicked us in the butt. We were on our asses, but we came back. And so you're saying, well, the Great Suppression, they destroyed all that, but maybe you don't appreciate the Gene Epsteins of this world, the entrepreneurial energy that's manifest.
It broke the supply chain, and
it broke, but not irreparably.
Not irreparable. Well, nothing is irreparable, and I generally have been surprised and inspired by the resilience of free people to fix the most incredibly messed up things that government does to us. And I think this is the most messed up thing I've seen in my lifetime. So you have lockdowns. A lot of businesses are prohibited from performing. They pour $6 trillion onto the economy, part of which is paying people not to work.
Precisely. Yes.
And of course, we now have pretty substantial inflation. And we have these weird anomalies in the labor market that you pointed out on Twitter, I think, this morning. So you have, in the face of all that, and this is what I want you to address.
Okay.
You have the Biden administration saying, one, that his spokesperson said, this is the strongest economy in history. And Biden saying zero inflation. And of course, I don't think those things are true. But bring it all together. This is why I'm calling it a perfect storm, because it's not just lockdowns, it's not just supply chain disruptions, it's all of this free money that is being financed by the Fed printing money, and on top of that, government keeps helping, and that to me makes it very difficult for entrepreneurs like you to fix it.
Yes. Okay. What you said could be correct in terms of a forecast, and I will not be surprised either way. Will this be a recession similar to 1991 and 2001? Will this be a worse recession than even 08, 09? I think both things are possible. You can make arguments on both sides, but although let me address what you've just said. Obviously, this is not a very strong economy. Paul Krugman, who of course can be relied on to give you misleading data no matter what, pointed out that in the first first year and a half of Biden, we had faster growth in employment than we had in the first year and a half under Trump. But of course, that's part of what I've been arguing, which is that we did have a fairly rapid recovery, because once the lockdown stopped and people resumed, then employment began to rise. Even though, as you point out, of course, there was huge disincentives to work, and only on the basis of the most recent numbers from the non-farm payroll employment, the establishment survey, we are only now back to the peak in terms of employment that we were in February of 2020. So we finally climbed back to that peak. That's not, we're not even at the expansion phase of employment. So, but it was fairly rapid in terms of the numbers, but we're just back at that peak. Although I do regard that as a bit of an achievement, although just to make things interesting, if you actually look at what's called a household survey, which tracks the unemployment rate, but which also has a figure for employment, the household survey says we're not back at that peak. And by the way, that resolves the point that was the question raised by Jeff Tucker and others. How is it that fewer people are working and yet we're back at the peak of employment? Well, the fact is that fewer people are working in terms of the household survey. The establishment survey is a little different, and it says we are back at the peak. So the household survey and the establishment survey are disagreeing, although the household survey does show a great deal of progress as well. But in both cases, the progress is heartening, but we are either back at the peak or we're not back at the peak. So this was not what you say, the most rapid economy, the fastest growing economy. This is simply a rebound from the past, and it's a rebound that I predicted. So therefore, I'm going to claim credit for it. I said that it could be hobbled by government issuing money to people to get them not to work. It could be hobbled because some of these businesses are never going to come back. My wife, but here you again, you're talking to an entrepreneur. My wife owns a rental building on 5 Bleecker Street. The restaurant that was there couldn't make a go of it, but we've got a new restaurant there. These two young guys who have every hopes, who are just working day and night to get that restaurant off the ground. And so if to the extent that the numbers are picked up, the restaurant that briefly disappeared at 5 Bleecker Street is back in business. So what do I belabor that point? I'm only saying then that I believe that capitalism, the free market, even though it's hobbled in many ways, don't estimate the energy. I think that indeed the supply chains are being fixed. People do cope. There are workarounds. I would even say, by the way, that I tweeted this morning something that I was predicting. Again, I'm not claiming to be much of a prognosticator. I'm bragging a lot today about my prediction. But I said, look, the Russians are going to find a way to sell their oil. You can't prevent oil from going to the marketplace. It's going to be. They're going to find workarounds. So the West will not buy their oil. So the Russians, as there was an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning, and I highlighted the Indian companies are buying immense amounts of Russian oil. The Chinese are picking it up. You've got oil to sell. We want to buy it because oil is it's black gold, and so they'll find workarounds. And they did. The Russian economy is not suffering. The price of oil is at $100. They're making more money from selling oil than they did a year ago. So again, all of those anecdotes show that that you can't underestimate the resilience of the world economy, of the entrepreneurial economy. With that said, we had a certain amount of fluttering. We have, in terms of the official measurements, GDP showed 2 quarters in a row of a contraction, mild contraction, first quarter and second quarter, but gross domestic income, which is another measure of broad output, actually increased somewhat. The average of the two is, so I don't even know if we're technically even in a recession yet. And so it's all pretty ambiguous. So I mean, maybe push me, maybe I can say a few more things, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to disappoint. You could be right. You're predicting, we'll see who's right. You hope I'm going to be right. You're predicting a severe downturn, worse than the 08-09, given all of those problems. Look, the immense amount. Why could you be right? Because of what David Stockman and Peter Schiff like to point to. Just look at what the Federal Reserve was doing, maintaining the Fed funds rate at 0%. Look at all that accumulate. Look at all the malinvestment that could be occurring. And by the way, I do have 2 measures. One of the measures that just based upon conventional measures. Conventional measures are, of course, the price earnings ratio in the stock market. The stock market did hit insupportable price earnings ratio, and so that indicated that it was going to peak, and we are now the beginnings of a bear market. The other one I look at is the house to rent ratio. I can take the house price, a measure of the house price that goes back actually to the 50s, and I can take that component of the consumer price index that tracks rents, and I can create a ratio. So the house price rent ratio, if you think about it, it should be, the choice of renting or the choice of owning should have a certain relationship to each other. And if the price of houses goes up way too high in terms of the rents, then you're looking, as you were in 05 and 06, you're looking at a housing bubble. The house price rent ratio is higher than ever, and so it indicates a certain bubble condition in the housing market. So that I can say. And so clearly we have the makings of a recession, we have the makings of a downturn, and I won't be surprised either way. And by the way, being a mild recession, a recession that's painful, but not as severe as 08-09, or you could be right, and it could be worse than 08-09 in terms of unemployment and general pain. Yeah.
Well, I am not a prognosticator at all. And,
okay. Well, but you made a prediction, so please quit with the bullshit.
Yeah. I'm hoping, by the way, that you're right and I'm wrong.
I know. Look, I'm hoping. Well, excuse me. I didn't say I'm predicting a mild recession. I said that I'm. I
think it's fully documented right here.
Okay. Let me go on record and say that I will not be surprised if you're right. Because I can see evidence for it just on the basis of what Stockman and Schiff like to say, both of whom are stopped clocks. Both of them are predicting that collapse will be just around the corner for the last 15 years.
Right.
By the way, and I'm not hurting. They'll still making. Stockman is still a multimillionaire, and Schiff will still be raking it in, even though I've insulted them. I wish they'd stop their stopped clock routines, because they give us Austrian free market economists a bad reputation. But the point is, but obviously they have a point, just on the basis of the Fed funds rate being at 0% of all that accumulation of money. It's clearly just signals malinvestment occurring in different parts of the economy that could be pretty severe now that the Federal Reserve is aggressively raising interest rates. Yeah.
So you've teased my last question. I love to ask this question. I asked it a lot in 2008. What would Mises do?
Oh my God, what would Mises do?
Like today, we just described how we got here, and we're sort of speculating as to how this might work out, and we're leaning on entrepreneurs and the American spirit to lift us out of the tremendous mess that the government has created.
Yeah.
What would Mises advise Joe Biden if he called him up and said, Ludwig, what should I do?
Oh, okay. Well, that's an easier question. Okay. and obviously we assume Joe Biden has the capacity to listen to Mises, and Mises is not going to soft soap him, because that's Mises. Mises was still holding on to his rent stabilized apartment, but because he needed it for security, he was earning chump change. But he's going to, well, obviously what he's going to tell Biden is that clearly all that we're really talking about, and this is what Hayek would have said too, pretty much, all that we're really facing is a wave of bankruptcies in the private economy. And bankruptcies happen all the time in the economy. It's just that there's going to be a huge concentration of bankruptcies in the private economy. And so, and the way to heal it, the way to deal with it, is to let the bankruptcies happen, as awful as that is. It's going to be painful to watch, but you have to allow the free market to sort these things out. People are going to be laid off, businesses are going to go bankrupt, but you need to allow a reorientation toward sustainable businesses that the free market will ultimately find. And then he's going to say, look up what happened famously in 1921, when the government did nothing, and it looked like a very severe downturn, but the free market sorted it out. Because anything else you do in order to stave off these bankruptcies is going to be counterproductive, because you've got this model in your mind that we're down, and so you want to make it, you want to sort of shore up those things that are down, and you don't realize it's malinvestment, it's mistakes, it's errors that were made, and of course errors are made all the time, and we think nothing of it. This guy had a restaurant, it didn't work out. He was trying to sell frog's legs to kosher people, and so he's got to shut it down. He's laying people off. Well, what are those people going to do? Well, they'll get a job at some other restaurant. They'll do something else for a living. And that's pretty much what you have to do, President Biden, is what Mises would say. Let it happen, and it could solve itself fairly quickly.
Let the economy heal. Let free people figure things out. Let entrepreneurs anticipate the future.
Exactly, and of course you now I guess I've passed my time, but you now prompt me to point out that the same lesson applied, of course, to the lockdowners, to COVID. Exactly the same thing. We allow people to protect themselves, to figure it out on themselves. You will have herd immunity, which I think actually did occur. The same philosophy applied, and the same rational advice applied to COVID as well.
Yeah, and I get this from the Austrians, that ultimately the market is just the process of people trying to figure things out. And cooperating and imagining the future and coming up with solutions. And what we didn't allow during COVID was that process. What we haven't allowed since then is that process. And my fear, my pessimism comes from Joe Biden's not going to listen to Ludwig von Mises' advice. He's going to keep helping. He's probably going to start propping up failure and let all that. Never let people heal the economy, and that's my concern. But we are running out of time, I promised you a chance to shamelessly plug the Soho Forum, and I didn't know that you were a suffering entrepreneur, so I feel like I really need to let you do this.
Okay, I'm glad I've tugged you to heartstrings, Matt, and turned you into a generous guy, even though I happen to know you're an extremely generous guy anyway. My Soul Forum has we have got 5 debates coming up. The one on September 19th is the next one. Well, will this be aired before September 19th? Do you think?
Nope. Plug away.
Okay, it won't.
Oh,
okay.
Yes. I'm sorry, I answered it wrong. It'll appear before that. So plug away.
Okay. Yeah. Well, then, if September 19th, we're going to be debating the resolution. It is imperative to abolish nuclear weapons. And a guy I've been a big fan of, Ward Wilson, who wrote a really great book called The 5 Myths of Nuclear Weapons that I recommend to everybody. One of the chapters is on the myth that Japan surrendered because of nuclear weapons. Another chapter is on how close we came to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And so he's been a big arguer for abolishing nuclear weapons. And so he's going to have a worthy opponent. That's September 19th. In October, I'm actually going to be debating a principal editorial writer for the New York Times who writes about economics for the New York Times, Benjamin Applebaum. And he's going to be defending a particular resolution having to do with his book. So that will be me against Binya. In November, I will have Jay Bhattacharya. You did. Again, I give you the award, Matt. Jay Bhattacharya is a great interview. He does a great job no matter who interviews him. You did the best interview with him because you had him answer a whole lot of sort of libertarian-oriented questions that he dealt with, and I think a lot of great wisdom came from it. But and I believe, by the way, that Jay is clearly by far the best guy. If you wanted a guy arguing about the lockdowns, I think in terms of his perspective and insight, there are many very good people out there who I've learned a lot from, but I think Jay Bhattacharya is the best. So he's coming in November to debate lockdowns against a worthy opponent from Harvard. In December and in January, by the way, I'm going to have Larry White of George Mason finally coming to the fore to defend the idea that the Federal Reserve should be abolished. And then actually in February, I haven't set that up yet, but I have the debate pretty much set on one side of the argument, an argument for the efficacy of a national divorce of secession. In December, we're going to debate nationalism. Nationalism, that's going to be defended by Rich Lowry, editor-in-chief of National Review. He's going to defend the idea of nationalism. And
wow.
We like conservatives against a libertarian. So that's our debates. But so if you go on thesoulforum.org, you can see all those debates listed. You can buy tickets. Afterwards, there's a party at my place just 2 blocks uptown. And I enjoy them. We look again, if you want to believe in you should come one of those dates, Matt, come to Manhattan, walk around, I'll escort you, come to the party. You'll feel all the energy. What has happened is the place where we used to have our debates went out of business. So we're now down the street at the Sheen Center, and the Sheen Center really doesn't have space for the after party. But since my loft apartment is only 2 blocks uptown, my dear wife Asako puts up with it and caters the parties, and we can fit about 120 people into our loft, and so it's a big space, and so we have the after parties, and usually the debaters come to the parties. And then imminently, we're going to release the debate we had on climate change between Stephen Koonin and Andrew Dessler. This was just 2 weeks ago. We had a problem getting it out because one of our Reason people was sick with COVID. Reason Foundation actually puts out the videos, and their key person was sick with COVID for a long time. So we haven't been able to release it, but hopefully in a day or two we will. But if you go on thesoulforum.org, you can get all this information. And then if you hit the donate button, you can help out a starving entrepreneur like me.
Yeah, we got to prove to the world that entrepreneurs can in fact survive even the stupidest of government policies.
Yes, exactly. And you do that by donating to the Soul Forum and coming to our debates.
Okay, Gene, I will, I've never been to a Soho Forum, so I'm going to commit to you. My wife, Terry, is sitting over here telling me that Terry has been there. But I commit to entering the hellscape that is New York to go to your event sometime this year, hopefully multiple times this year. Wonderful. And I want to thank you so much for doing this, and let's talk again.
A pleasure as always. Bye-bye. Yeah.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.